it's the start of Mental Health Awareness Week, and I'm going to be posting a series of both written and video pieces around mental health this week. So things like how to prevent being overwhelmed, but also from the company's perspective, how to manage mental health at work. So today it's all about you. It's from the individual perspective. And I want to start with the premise that you simply cannot help others if you yourself are not in a fit state. Now, this doesn't mean that you're at burnout or at overwhelmed with stress, but it is about making sure that your health, both your physical and your mental health, it's not ignored. It's not way down the list of priorities because you've simply got too much other stuff to deal with. So just like the airline safety announcement says, secure your oxygen mask first before you assist others. Now, to start with, we're going to look at how the stress response system works, because when we understand something, we are more likely to be able to change it. Without that understanding, we remain reactive, doing what we've always done simply because we don't know how to bring in change. And it all starts with the brain. Our brains were brilliant at keeping our ancestors alive, and they're the reason that we're all sitting here today, but they were imperfect for our modern day lives. Now, we can split the brain into roughly two sections. The intellectual part of the brain, the cortex, it's the sort of grey matter that you're probably familiar with on TV shows and seeing it in pictures. That's the bit you're in now when you're listening to me, because it's the bit that we use when we're interacting with the world. It's where we learn, and it's also where we make really good positive decisions from. It's where we plan from. There's also another part called the primitive part of the brain. Now, this bit is really interested in your security and your survival. The limbic system looks after your autonomic functions, things like your heart beating, your oxygen exchange going on, temperature control, all those things that have to go on without you thinking about it, because if you had to think about each heartbeat, you'd probably forget, you probably wouldn't last very long. There's also the bit that looks after your survival. That is your freeze, flight, fight, response centre. Now, I want to put it into context. I want to talk a little bit about our evolution versus the revolution that we've really gone through in the last really few decades. So humans have been in development for around 5 to 6 million years from our very primitive ape-like ancestors. Our current form, Homo sapiens, have been around for about 100 to 150,000 years. Our civilization dates back only 6,000 years when our ancestors, the Sumerians of Mesopotamia, started writing, started doing serious crop cultivation, brought in numbers so that they could keep records of things. The Industrial Revolution happened around 200 years ago, but that's the framework for our modern working lives. In fact, we still use it today. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of recreation, 8 hours of sleep. Then we move forward into the 1950s and 1970s, which was known as the digital age, which saw quite a lot of leaps and bounds in technology. And now we're in our current technological age, which is roughly around 20 to 30 years old, where we've had massive, massive changes in the way we're living our lives, our use of digital media. Evolution takes time, but the pace of change to our modern environment has happened in the blink of an eye. Our brains simply haven't noticed that the wallpaper has changed. And that primitive part of the brain developed with the sole purpose of getting us through today so that we live again tomorrow. It's not interested in your happiness, your self-esteem, your self-actualization. It is all about survival. And a part of that is about being in a negative zone, basically assuming that everything is out to kill you or eat you, so that the primitive brain is necessarily negative. It will always look at things from the worst possible perspective. It's obsessional as well, because it's always looking out for your safety. It always wants to check that things are as they should be. And it's alert. Now, the more stressed you feel, the more alert you are. So you can start racking up and becoming in a hyper alert state. And when you feel stress in one area of your life, you tend to have it in other areas of your life simply because that part of the brain is literally looking to pick a fight with anything because it is ready to keep you alive. Now, it will always operate under the primitive parameters of freeze, flight, fight, which was great when we were living in the wilds, but it's not so good when that bank statement arrives or when you've had an argument, because our life or death situations have been translated into anything that acts as a barrier to us getting what we want or need. So it's the traffic jams that we have to sit in, crowded trains, arguments that we have, financial problems, redundancy, relationship issues, the deadlines that we have to work to, heavy workloads, running late. All these little things that drip feed and it accumulates into bigger and bigger things. Now, the emotional primitive part of the brain will override the intellectual part of the brain to help if it thinks that your life is in some sort of an emergency or crisis. So think of people who go into road rage when they get cut up, or who start feeling, if you feel anxious or angry, if the lights go red, that is that primitive part of the brain taking over and putting you into the freeze, flight, fight response. And it's not only the real events in our lives, but also the imagined ones, because our primitive brain can't tell the difference between imagination and reality. All those big life events that we encounter, moving house and new jobs, building businesses, and it's also the small things like meetings that we have to go to, the journeys into work, deadlines we have to get to work to, difficult clients, perhaps children being slow as you're trying to get out of the door in the morning. Now, we also negatively retrospect about the past. We think about all those should've, would've, could'ves. I want you to imagine that you have a metaphorical bucket in your head. We're going to call it a stress bucket. It's where all these real life experiences and imagined ones go. It fills up the bucket until eventually you can see that it would fill up to the top. Now, when it overflows, that's when we go into meltdown. And it's often only a tiny thing, something like being clumsy, spilling water. It's not really about that particular incident, but a result of having a full stress bucket. And we tend to go into full-on meltdown over the simplest things. So to stop stress overwhelm, we need a two-pronged approach. The first is to stop filling your stress bucket with more negative thoughts, more overthinking. We need to focus more on the positives in your lives, and that will actually start to change the chemical balance in your body. We also need to empty the stress bucket. We do that when we sleep at night, when we go through particularly a phase called REM, rapid eye movement. That's when our brain looks at stuff in the bucket, processes it through, does it need to keep it in there, or can it move it into our long-term memory banks? But sleep is a whole other talk. Now, what happens when we suffer from stress overload? Well, there are a number of warning signs and symptoms. We have the physical ones like pounding hearts, sweaty palms, you might get indigestion or stomach upsets, shortness of breath, feel tense muscles as we hold everything, really tensely, particularly in the jaw and in the shoulders. You might get headaches, nausea, skin rashes, sleeplessness, or even oversleeping, a feeling of fatigue. We also have the emotional ones, the low moods, feeling irritable, edgy, maybe anxious or hostile, feeling nervous or cynical, maybe lacking your usual sense of humour, your sense of self, lacking a sense of direction, feeling unmotivated, feeling even low or into depression. And we can also suffer from behavioural signs, so forgetting to do stuff, losing concentration, losing our sense of perspective as well, having difficulty thinking clearly, being unable to make decisions, perhaps being disorganised, snapping, losing your temper, being unable to see another person's point of view. We also start to habitually indulge in negative self-talk. We find it harder than normal to do quite logical tasks. We might even start relying on addictions in order to switch off, things like having a couple of glasses of wine in the evening just to de-stress. Now, Throughout our lives, we move through a continual wave of kind of feeling okay, moving up into anxiety, down into low mood or depression. And we go through that throughout the day, changing minutes, changing days, changing months. It's normal. So how do we move from this kind of stressed out automatic pilot mode, which would just rack up all those stress levels, to a much more present, mindful being mode, which prevents that stress from building up? Now remember all that time travelling that we tend to do when we negatively forecast the future, we ruminate on the past, and it fills that stress bucket with useless anxiety and worry. We can use that same imagination to create positive forecasts. So think about how great you'll feel when the race is done, the talk is over, the presentation has finished, how proud you'll feel when you've handled the client or made the deadline. Another skill is just in stopping the overthinking. Recognise when you're going through that negative self-talk, divert the mind onto something else. You can use techniques like breathing or gratitude. Now, increasing our gratitude has been widely recognised as a key means of reducing stress. Effectively, it's the opposite of what stress does. In clinical trials, the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine found that people who practiced gratitude had 23% lower levels of cortisol, which is the stress hormone. It also helps to boost the immune system. It lowers blood pressure, facilitates more effective sleep. And remember, sleep is important to empty our stress bucket. And it even reduces the effects of aging on the brain. So effectively, when we are more grateful, we feel more connected with ourselves and with our environment. And that's really the opposite of what stress does. We become much more aware, more curious, more optimistic about things. When we're stressed, we are feeling more closed down in our thinking. We have tunnel vision because stress is all about spotlighting the danger. And we tend to fall into a negative cycle. The more stuff you put in your stress bucket, the more time you're encouraged to spend in that primitive negative part of your brain, the more negative thoughts are thrown out that will then go in the stress bucket. And finally, we can mimic our primitive ancestors because they evolved through a series of chemical trial and error. When they did things that made them feel good, they did more of it. So it became their preferred behaviours, their norms. When they successfully hunted and gathered, when they supported their families, they felt good. When they interacted with other humans, when they formed tribes, because we're stronger and better able to survive when we're part of a group. Alone, we are weak and vulnerable to death by predation or starvation. So we are pre-programmed to want to be part of groups, to interact with other people. And these behaviours promoted the release of a certain neurotransmitter. It's a hormone that made our ancestors feel good. It made them feel braver. It made them feel better able to cope, and it even helped them to deal with physical pain. Now, the most important neurotransmitter is serotonin. It's really our go-to hormone for keeping us on an even keel, and it's known as the happiness hormone. Now, in order to produce a constant supply of serotonin, we need to do what our ancestors did. We need to interact in a positive way, be part of a tribe. We need to be active in a positive way. Now, that doesn't mean joining a gym and going, 3 hours every day. It just means bringing movement into your life. And we need to think in a positive way. Because when we do those 3 things, we create patterns in the brain that give us that constant release of serotonin. And when we do that, we are better able to cope with whatever life throws at us. It also helps to cap the release of cortisol, because without serotonin in the system, that cortisol can keep going, being released unchecked, and that has serious implications for our health. So, one small step that you can take away today: when it's time to go to sleep, think of 3 good things about your day. Now, you can either write them down in a gratitude journal or simply acknowledge them in your head. Just practice doing that every night, because you're training your brain to look for the positives in the day, which is the opposite of what it would normally do, which is to think negatively. And you can start training your family's brains as well. Instead of asking them just how was your day, ask them to tell you what was good about their day. Ask them what they liked best about their day. Ask them what they had for lunch that they really enjoyed. So that's it really. To improve your stress levels, start with the 3 Ps: positive interaction, positive activity, and positive thinking.